What's up, beautiful people? Today we're covering slavery in the British colonies. Like other European empires in the Americas that participated in the Atlantic slave trade, the English colonies developed a system of slavery that reflected the specific economic, demographic, and geographic characteristics of those colonies. Regardless, all of the British colonies participated in the Atlantic slave trade. Now, to be clear, slavery was much more important to some regions than others, but to be even clearer, every colony in North America had slavery. So, what were the reasons the institution of slavery developed? There was an abundance of land in the colonies, and over time, indentured servants were not meeting the labor needs of the colonies. As things slightly improved in Europe, less people were coming over to North America as indentured servants. Events such as Bacon's Rebellion worried the colonial elite. Former indentured servants and formerly enslaved people were starting to make demands. Crazy stuff like land that was promised, fair taxes, better treatment, and it seemed so much easier to switch to a labor source that was permanent, race-based, and treated the laborers as property. Add to all this, there was a growing demand in Europe for colonial goods, and as a result, slavery will develop in the British colonies. As slavery developed throughout the British colonies, it differed in the various British colonial regions. In the New England colonies, a small number of enslaved laborers were used on small farms, and more were used in port cities to complete various tasks. Slavery was much more a part of the economic and social system of the Chesapeake and Southern colonies, as large numbers of people were enslaved in these regions, serving as the primary labor source in the tobacco plantations of Virginia and rice plantations of South Carolina. And as we've seen, in the case of South Carolina, enslaved people made up the majority of the population. While slavery was a fact of life in the 13 colonies, the great majority of enslaved Africans would not be brought into the 13 colonies. The majority of enslaved people in the British colonies would be sent to the West Indies, and a large number of slaves would be sent to the Spanish Caribbean colonies as well, and to the Portuguese colony of Brazil. Now, we know 1619 marked the year in which enslaved people were brought into the British colonies for the first time in Virginia, and in the colonies, the form of slavery that developed was known as chattel slavery. Chattel slavery means that the enslaved person is legally rendered the personal property or chattel of the slave owner. As chattel slavery became the dominant labor system in many southern colonies, new laws created a strict racial system. Examples of such laws include those that prohibited interracial relationships, laws that define the descendants of African American mothers, fancy way of saying children, as black and enslaved in perpetuity. And by perpetuity, we mean forever. While indentured servants were not treated especially well, poor indentured servants did have certain rights. They couldn't be forced to work forever. Laws had been fought for in Europe and won, protecting those individuals. On the other hand, no laws protected African people forcibly brought over. Laws such as bans on interracial unions, ensuring a child born to a person enslaved was also born a slave, and the fact that enslaved people were considered chattel purposefully created a strict racial system. But race is not real. The idea of race was created by people in power to justify policies that made some folks a lot of money and to justify the horrific institution of slavery. And in spite of how some history books try to portray slavery, notice the enslaved person on the ship is wearing a suit and shaking hands as they're about to make some sort of business deal. I mean, talk about an intentional misrepresentation of the reality of the dehumanizing institution that was slavery and the Middle Passage. Slavery was freaking awful. In response to the dehumanizing nature of slavery, enslaved people resisted in both covert and overt ways. Most resistance to slavery was covert, or rather concealed or hidden. For instance, many enslaved people continued to practice their cultural beliefs, spoke their native language, and incorporated elements of their African identity into this new society. Enslaved people also formed extended families, participated in work slowdowns, faked being sick, and various other methods of resistance to the institution of slavery. Overt forms of resistance were not as common, since various laws kept enslaved people under strict control, and open resistance could result in a person being physically punished, sold away from their family, or even killed. But there are examples of this form of resistance being utilized. Running away was a method of overt resistance with many risks, but was done. And perhaps the most threatening of the forms of resistance was in fact open rebellion. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 was the largest uprising of enslaved people in the North American colonies. Weapons were stolen by a small group of enslaved men near the Stono River in South Carolina. Some white folks were killed, other enslaved individuals joined the rebellion, but after about 20 white people were killed, the South Carolinian militia eventually rolled up and crushed this rebellion. Ultimately, over 50 enslaved people lost their lives trying to rebel with the hopes of gaining their freedom in Spanish Florida. While the Stono Rebellion did fail, though, the fact that it even took place reveals that the happy slave narrative pushed by defenders of slavery, and even some textbooks like you see right there, is complete garbage. And while you may think that the days of school textbooks minimizing the inhumanity of slavery like you see right there are long gone, this children's book that was being sold in 2016 depicts enslaved people of George Washington happily baking him a cake for his birthday. In our next video, we will take a quick look at colonial society and culture, see what all these people were thinking and doing at this time. But until next time, thank you so much for watching this Jocz Productions video. Have a beautiful day. Peace.